right? With all their guns and handcuffs on and everything. And they're saying, here's Steve. Steve is going to be one of our intelligence analysts. I'm thinking in my head, what am I doing here? I do not belong in Washington, D.C., talking to people who are going to go to the White House and meet with President Bush in about an hour. This is not who I am. It was very exciting. I won't fool you. It was a great experience, and I wouldn't trade it in. But deep down, I was thinking, you got the wrong guy. And that's what Saul must have been thinking. He's saying, I'm the guy that people want. I'm the guy that is going to, I forget how it's worded. I'm going to have all that is desirable in Israel. He says, you got to be mistaken. But that's how God does it. See, God doesn't erase what I said about myself. God didn't pick Saul because he was qualified. He didn't pick Saul because he was had the ability to be king. God picked Saul because it was God's plan to pick Saul. And the fact that I'm up here in the pulpit is sort of the same thing. And I still have no seminary degree. At the time you all selected me, I had no experience. I had no seminary degree. I didn't know what I was about to do. And it's like, so you were very biblical in choosing me because you knew that I wasn't qualified. You knew that I didn't have the check boxes checked. But I trust that you believed that it was the Lord's will that I was here, that I become the pastor. I still don't understand it. Even when I come up here and when people call me pastor and when I see it written down on the page, it's like, how did I ever get here? How did this happen? I never in my, at the time, 45 years of life when I was, ordained and installed here, 45, 46 at the time, it wasn't on my radar. But it was the Lord's, I believe, and I hope you believe, it was the Lord's will that I become pastor. And that's what Samuel is facing here. He's facing this crisis of belief now we're getting into in verses, we're in it now, 19 through 25. Is this crisis of belief. He's saying, is this really happening to me? How am I going to deal with this? How am I going to handle this? He might have been thinking, I'm going to go back to Dad. I'm going to go back to Father Kish and his wife Mish. No, I said that last week. I'm going to go back to Dad because this is all wrong. This is not the way my life was going. But here I am. But to his credit, he kept going with it, and he kept following the ways of the Lord. And they go, and Samuel invites Saul. I wish they were a little bit different names because I always interchange them. Samuel invites Saul to come up and go to this banquet, this hall, where they're having the sacrifice to eat with him. And Saul goes up, and Samuel places him at the head of the table. There's about 30 people in attendance. They bring him to the head of the table. They give him the choice piece of meat, the choice piece of the animal that was sacrificed. And he says, eat, because it was kept for you until the hour appointed that you might eat with the guests. So Saul ate with Samuel that day. And when they came down from the high place into the city, a bed was spread for Saul on the roof, and he lay down to sleep. So you can see, again, God's providence working all through this. The threads of the fabric all working through this. How God brought Saul, how he brought Samuel up for this moment. And finally, they meet. Next week, we're going to look at the actual anointing, which is somewhat anticlimactic also. There's nobody there. It's not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with screamers and, people selling things or anything like that. It's very just kind of normal, but it has huge impact in the history of Israel. So, Saul it's going to be interesting, I hope, for you as well as for me, to see Saul, how he evolves through this, how he goes from this saying to himself, perhaps, this can't be right. This isn't what I was expecting in life. All the way to when he is king, when he starts reigning, when he starts ruling over the nation, when he starts his downfall. It's very interesting to see all that happen. And he makes some big wrong moves in his life. And we'll see his journey. And it's not necessarily a story about Saul. It's not necessarily a story about Samuel. It's a story about God and how he works with his people, with his nation, how much he loves his nation. And as I said, either last week or 2 weeks ago, if you zoom out to wide angle now, you see that God is bringing all this about in order to show that this king, Saul, is not going to be really what they need. And he's showing the people that he's not what they need. And then we'll see David come up in a little while, in several weeks. And David will be a great king, the best king, but he's still not quite what the nation of Israel needs. And what it is, zoom out again, it's all pointing to the one thing that the nation of Israel needs, and the one thing that we all need is Jesus Christ. That final sacrifice. We see the sacrifice here, the dinner that they were at. We're going to meet the Lord's table in a moment here. That Christ is a sacrifice. And we'll see that all evolve. It's really hard to preach through a book like this because it's one big story, and we're cutting it out week by week. And I hope that you do read through it, get familiar with it. Read through 1 and 2 Samuel just once over the next coming weeks. And that'll help you to see the big picture. And as we go through week by week, you'll be able to kind of categorize it in where, have it fall where it belongs. So I'm going to leave this sermon there, and then we're going to pick up at verse 26, because that sort of starts through, and we'll go through much of 10. Maybe not all of chapter 10 next week, but we'll go through into 10, and we'll see Saul actually anointed and become king over Israel. So let me say a prayer, and then we will sing another hymn as we prepare for the Lord's Supper.